Special thanks to the K Family Foundation, lead underwriters for MOSAIC. Hello, my name is Barbara Kay, and on behalf of the Jewish Federation of Palm Beach County, I'd like to welcome you to our program, MOSAIC. Our special guest on MOSAIC today is the award-winning author, lecturer, leading ethicist, Rabbi Joseph Teluskin. We'll be back with our guest and our program right after this brief message.
Thanks to your support, Federation maintains the fabric of the Jewish community. By enabling our community to remain vital and vibrant today and for future generations.
Mentoring more than 400 at-risk children through the Youth Futures program in Federation's partnered communities of Israel's Tzachar region.
Providing a wealth of social, welfare, spiritual and educational services available to the 110,000 members of the Jewish community in St. Petersburg, Russia.
We touch so many and do so much. Your dollars fund the work of our Federation. Thank you for your generous support.
Welcome back to MOSAIC, Rabbi. Such a pleasure to have you here.
I don't know which visit this is, Barbara, but they're always wonderful.
It's always a special pleasure. Listen, Rabbi, you have written 16 books, you've had TV scripts, you've had a movie, etc., etc., etc. You're amazing. I've read, not all of your 16 books, but I've read a few of them here, and they're incredible. In the preface to the 9 questions that you co-authored with Dennis Prager about Judaism, you wrote that you've always had a passion for Judaism. Okay? What created that passion, do you think?
This is a very interesting question, you know, because human behavior is usually influenced by heredity and environment, and the religious addition to that equation is the soul. So obviously it came embedded somehow in my soul, affected by my heredity and environment. I come from generations of rabbis, and I was raised in a passionately Jewish household, and it resonated with me. Now, that doesn't have to be the case. There are people who come out of strong Jewish environments who don't, but somehow it captured me both in terms of my heart and in my intellect. And you always know when something's a passion, when you think about it, you know, even when you're not doing it. Let's say you have a profession. If you go find out that your doctor, outside of his medical hours, never read about medicine, never liked to meet and talk with other doctors, you know, you'd start getting a little nervous. So this was my passion, because whatever I'm doing, it ends up penetrating into the conversations that I'm having.
Yeah, you know, you were very young. I think I read something like 6 years old. And your grandfather, I think, was very influential in your life?
My grandfather, my paternal grandfather, Rabbi Teluskin, who was a very prominent rabbinical scholar, was a big influence in my life, and he, you know, which was a nice thing for me. He had a high regard for me, which wasn't always that easy in terms of future capabilities, because I was a bad student. Dennis Prager and I became friends in high school. And one of the things that unified us is we were both not good students.
You're kidding,
we had
really?
a class of 110 students, which for a day school, the yeshiva of Flatbush was pretty large. I graduated 83rd in the grade, and Dennis was 91st or 92nd. So, but what happened was, and I don't say this with pride, this is not like a form of reverse bragging, you know, but what I'm saying is both of us tended to have intense interests and to follow our intense interests. I did not have a big interest in the sciences, and as a result, you know, I'm deficient in my knowledge of sciences. But you know, life has a way of, in high school, you're rewarded if you're pretty good in everything, to be all around. But in general in life, you're rewarded for being good in one thing. So this was my passion, was my Jewish stuff.
Mm. You know, it's fascinating because everybody has an epiphany in some direction, and if you're lucky enough. Mine was when I went to Israel the first time. Nonetheless, I was reading something, Elie Wiesel said something interesting. He said, you know, you can love God, you can fight with God, but you can't ignore God.
Right.
What did he mean?
He meant that the relationship with God can be complicated, but you can't just eliminate God and hope we're going to stay within a Jewish context. God is part of the Jewish equation. So if, you know, Wiesel, you could imagine in the aftermath of the Holocaust, could have been very enraged and wanted to deny God, but he didn't. But if he didn't deny God, he couldn't just love God either. You know, his emotions were a little more complicated. So some Jews took the position there is no God, which is funny because in their heart of hearts, I don't even think they believe that, because there is no God, but they're still angry at him. You know, it's an inconsistent position. So I think Wiesel wanted to legitimate the possibility of having that frustration and the anger, but he didn't want to legitimate the possibility of just eliminating God from the equation, because there is ultimately no survival for Judaism without God.
Yeah. Are we mandated, do you think, as a people, to make the world a better place?
I think we're mandated as a people by the very demands of Judaism, but it goes beyond it being a mandate. You know, the notion of l'taken olam b'malchut shaddai, to perfect the world under the rule of God. But we're also mandated out of a very pragmatic self-need. Ultimately, what happened in Germany was what happened when the values, that the exact opposite values of Judaism, triumph. Jews have a vested interest in the world being better because we're the victims of those who make the world worse. And they tend to turn on the Jews because the Jews introduced the notion of God into the world, introduced the notion of a universal moral standard, introduced the notion of striving for an ethical perfection, of tikkun olam, of perfecting the world. So people who have those ideas, Hitler, as was recorded, forgetting the man's name, there was an early follower of Hitler who later broke with Hitler, and he published a book called Hitler's Table Talk, because he was present at dinner meals with Hitler, and he recorded in his diaries, Hitler would say things like, his mission in life was to destroy the Asiatic god tyrant of the Jews and his life-denying 10 Commandments. So I think on moral, spiritual grounds, we're mandated to make the world better, because if we believe that the rest of the world is filled with human beings created in God's image, so we have to help them. But I'm also arguing on pragmatic grounds, we will end up being the victims of a world we didn't influence, because it will be influenced, the world, and if it's influenced by those other values, those values will be hostile to us.
Okay. Let's talk about the fact that people are very religious in terms of people who go through the ritual. They go to synagogue constantly, they follow all the laws, but they're not tremendously ethical in their behavior. Are those religious people?
No, because if they believe that Jewish law is binding on them, then they have no basis for not following the ethical laws. People who claim to be religious often accuse Jews who are less observant of picking and choosing. But that's then what they're doing. You know, now all of this resulted from a very sad fact, which is that in the popular mind, the word religious came to mean exclusively ritual observance. So that if two Jews are talking about a third, which is not an uncommon occurrence in the Jewish community, and the question is raised, is so-and-so religious, the answer yes or no is going to be based on the person's level of ritual observance. He keeps Shabbat, he keeps Kashrut, he is religious. She doesn't keep Shabbat, she doesn't keep kosher, she's not, from which one could form the very odd impression that in Judaism, ethics are an extracurricular activity. And that's very, very unfortunate. when people come to do that. Now, again, I don't want to make it seem, like religious people are less ethical. I think very often they're more, but it's more jarring to us when we see a lack of appropriate ethical behavior in a person who's religious.
Yeah, I think our religion is based on mitzvot.
Right.
And doing good deeds, and to love thy neighbor.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that's interesting is in order to love your neighbor and do good things, you have to love yourself.
Yes, I think that's very critical, and that's an important point you've picked up on, because the explicit command is to love your neighbor, but the implicit command is to love yourself. I wonder if there's been an abusive parent in history who had a good self-image. And think about it in your life, in my life, in all of our listeners' lives. When are you apt to be more forgiving of other people's mistakes or bad behavior? Usually when you're feeling good about yourself. When a person is feeling insecure, they are more apt to be more critical of others. Children learn at a young age if they need to get something from their parents, they usually try and wait till when their parents are feeling good about themselves and are therefore in good moods. They know that if you go and the parent himself is under stress or insecure or not feeling well, that doesn't bring out the best in people. So I think self-esteem is important, not only for our own sake, but it's important for how we're going to treat others. People are raised to have a low sense of self-esteem and treat themselves poorly. There's a good chance they're not going to be all that good in how they treat others.
Yeah, interesting. You wrote, one of the books that you wrote was Love Your Neighbor as Yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a fascinating book. Because
you.
it really, I'm telling you, for a lay person, it's easy reading, and it also taught me a lot. Some things I never in my wildest dreams ever thought about. You cover a lot of subjects in this, and one of the things that I think is interesting is the idea of charity and philanthropy.
Right.
And what it means when you think about your neighbor, you also have to be charitable to your neighbor.
Mm-hmm.
But you bring up some very interesting points. You want to share that with us?
Well, first of all, one of the points I bring there is Maimonides, the great 13th century, actually most of his life was lived in the 12th century. The great 12th century Jewish teacher actually had a list of charity in order of its most valuable priorities.
Yeah.
And to him, the highest priority was getting people out of charity. In other words, lending someone money to start a business, finding work for somebody. Because the goal was not to give people in need, the goal was to liberate people from being in need. I remember I once heard a statement attributed to an early 20th century rabbi, Chaim Soloveitchik. He said of a certain man, he likes giving charity too much to be a really good person, but which he meant that he likes the fact that there are people dependent on him. So Maimonides said the goal is to wean people out of it. Therefore, it's a very important element in government to do job training with people. But having said that, the Bible also tells us the poor will always be among you. There's always going to be poor people. So you don't want people to become hard-hearted and self-righteous and think, oh, that person could, he or she, they can get out of it themselves. There are things that happen to people. There are people who face much worse challenges and harder challenges in life than we do. And rather, therefore, than being critical of them, see this as an opportunity to be a good person. Also, there's a wheel that turns in the world, as the Talmud famously puts it, and who knows about it? German Jews were a very, by and large, a successful Jewish community in the 1920s, or more so than the rest of Jewry. Many of them ended up in the 30s having to flee Germany, and they were penniless. I'm conscious that that could happen to me. God forbid, I don't want it to happen to me. God forbid, I don't want it to happen to you. But we don't know what our future situation is going to be. And so therefore, be empathetic. Rather than look at other people and see their problems and see why they might be responsible for their problems, offer the help that you can to relieve their problems, and offer the help that you can to relieve their economic misery. Empathize, because we don't know. There's a story they tell where a young child is walking with his father, and the kid has led a pretty sheltered existence, and he sees a beggar in the street who seems quite miserable, and he sees somebody walking who has a bad physical deformity. He sees a whole bunch of sad things, and he turns to his father and he says, "Dad, why doesn't God do something? Why doesn't God send someone?" And his father said to him, "He sent you."
On that note, we're going to take a break. We'll be back with the remainder of our program right after this brief message. Welcome back to Mosaic. Prior to the break, we were talking about loving your neighbor as yourself, all kinds of ethical opportunities in the world for people, and how to be religious, truly religious, you have to be an ethical person in many cases. You really do.
Right.
But there's such a thing as, would you describe the meaning of Lashon Hara? The Hebrew word Lashon Hara.
Lashon Hara is the Hebrew, which literally means bad tongue or evil tongue. And it refers to speaking unfairly about others. It is often translated as gossip, but gossip's not really an adequate translation, because gossip might be true, might not be true, might be trivial. Lashon Hara is, by definition, something that's true about another person, but it's unfair to spread. Like, I'll often ask an audience when I'm speaking to people, how many of you can think of at least one episode in your life that you'd be embarrassed about if it became known to everybody else here? You know, and invariably everybody's hand goes up, except for a few people I say who are liars or who have very poor memories or who have led very boring lives. So the truth is, we all have secrets in our own lives that we don't want others to know. What's not fair about human nature but we're interested in other people's secrets. So that if you were about to walk into a room, you open the door, you hear the people inside talking about you, what you would least like to hear them talking about are your character flaws and the intimate details of your social life. But when we gossip about others, what are we most likely to gossip about? Other people's character flaws and the intimate details of their social life. Which is why I say, if you want to avoid speaking Lashon Hara, you want to minimize it, never speak about another person for more than 2 or 3 minutes. Because the moment we do, people don't, what are you going to spend 20 minutes? Oh, you know that story that shows how nice she is? I know an even nicer story. The truth is, what's most interesting about people is what's not so nice. You know, among my 16 books, I've written a number of murder mysteries. And somebody said, "Why do you write murder mysteries? You know, why did you write a good mystery?" I said, "What's a good mystery?" Somebody's been going around doing anonymous good deeds in the community, and there are 5 suspects. But my my wife, Devorah, worked for many years for the great Yiddish writer Isaac Bashevis Singer, who, of course, won the Nobel Prize.
We had him on our program, by the way.
Oh, that would make sense. That would make sense, of course. And Isaac used to say, even good people don't like to read novels about good people. In other words, goodness tends not to be that interesting. It's unfortunate. So as a result, when we speak about others, we often speak in a critical and unfair way. And I spent quite a bit of time trying to get organized a National Speak No Evil Day, to get people to go for one day.
But you had something special happen because of it. Share that. Didn't they have a Speak No Evil Day?
Well, actually what happened was 2 senators, obviously I wanted it to be a bipartisan resolution, so I went to 2 senators, Joe Lieberman of Connecticut and Connie Mack, who was the senator at the time from Florida, and they really did sponsor such a resolution. Yes. We never got enough senatorial co-sponsors.
Yeah, but the idea was terrific.
The idea was terrific, and I wrote about it, and I found out that, you know, every once in a while I'll get a letter about it. A school system in one of the suburbs of Chicago instituted it, and who knows what good things might have resulted from their going for one day without anybody speaking unfairly about another.
You know, words can heal and words can hurt.
Right.
And I use this phrase constantly. perception is 95% of reality. And if you write something that is hurtful over and over again about a subject, people start to believe it.
Well, listen, many of the tragedies that happened to the Jewish people throughout history came because terrible lies were told about them, and lies become accepted. By the way, even in personal life it happens. You know, if you hear that so-and-so has a bad temper, he's always exploding, you might see that person get angry, and had you not been told that in advance, you might have thought that their anger was justified. But obviously, once you have a stereotyped image of a person, so it's going to be consistent with that stereotype. And since what people say about others is, as I put it, often not nice. You and I are talking about somebody we know in common, and I say to you, I love that guy. He's a fantastic person. There's only one thing I can't stand about him. What are we going to talk about? The one thing. So you're right. It has a very poor effect on perceptions.
Yeah. You know, we're living in a excuse me, Rabbi, we're living in a very difficult, chaotic world today. There's a tremendous amount of anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism, economic concerns, upheaval all throughout the countries in the Middle East. People need hope. They need help.
Right.
What, as a rabbi, what would you tell somebody to do if they're upset and disturbed and find it difficult to live in this kind of world?
It's funny, I'm thinking of a story I heard many years ago in the aftermath of the stock market collapse of 1929, which set in the famous Depression. So there was a member of the congregation of a very famous Reform rabbi, Stephen S. Wise. And the man really lost everything in the market. He had only one asset left, his life insurance policy. So he got the idea into his head that he was going to commit suicide and leave that for his family. You know, people say if you commit suicide, you don't collect on your life insurance, but that's only if you kill yourself very shortly after you took it out. But he had had the policy for many years. And he went to consult with Wise if this was appropriate. Now, I suspect in his heart he didn't want to commit suicide, because if you're thinking of committing suicide, you don't go and ask a rabbi whether you can do it. But anyway, he told Wise, and Wise said, so explain to me why you're going to do it. You want to do it to give money to your family, right? And the man said, yes. So he said, so you're doing it for your family? The man said, yes. So Wise said, I therefore suggest you go consult with your family. Ask them what you should do. If they tell you they want you to remain alive, even if you're poor, well, then you know, don't commit suicide. They don't want it. And if they tell you you should go ahead and kill yourself, he says, tell me, my friend, are you going to kill yourself for the sake of a selfish group like that? But it was a funny line. No, during these hard times, and it's not like it's something foreign to me to think about. We have to focus on those things that are good within our lives. We have to remember our ancestors, by and large, were poorer than we are. And yet, do we have to assume that their whole lives were miserable? We have to focus on those very precious things that are within our power. God willing, the person who's very upset over financial loss, I hope he or she is not equally upset over their marital situation, over their children. But look for those things that really are capable of generating a sense of hope, and work on oneself. I mean, you have to, because the sky is not falling. And we can't always do it, but we have to look on those things. I'll tell you one thing, it's a good thing for people to do. Number one, consider things that you have done in your life of which you're proud. You know, our minds very much follow what our thoughts are. You know who knows that? Actors know it. Actors know. Let's say an actor or an actress has to play a scene that's very sad. So they're told, it's a basic formula in acting, try and recall some very sad memory from your own life, and it can bring you to tears.
Good call.
But the point is, can we recall happy memories, happy things? Because when people fall into an emotional funk, what often happens is that they get overwhelmed, they can't stop thinking about it. So I say to people, just really relax in your chair and start to think about those things that have been positive in your life and that can give you some sense of hope. Because those are things on which you can build. There's a famous teaching of Hillel, if not now, when? And that statement has become widely known. It's often used in the political sphere. You know, if you have to make a change in the economy, if not now, when. I say to people, even now, for the next 30 seconds, just stop whatever you're doing and think, how does if not now, when apply in my life? Because often we become very passive in the face of hardships, and our nervousness and our insecurities make us more passive, and our passiveness in turn feeds our sense of depression. So I say to people, where does the teaching, if not now, when, apply in your own life? I don't think we can suddenly, in the middle of a television episode, just go silent for 30 seconds. But as soon as this episode ends, I ask you, sit back in your chair and ask yourself, how does if not now, when apply in my life? What does it teach me I can do differently? If a lot of your insecurities are in professional things, is there something you can do? It is so important to avoid seeing yourself just as a passive victim of what is happening, because that very sense of passivity will cause you to become more passive, and that will feed a cycle of impotence and a cowardliness. And therefore, we have to think, what can I do?
Okay. When this episode is over, I'm gonna try exactly the formula. I'm gonna close my eyes and sit back and think about it, because I think it sounds very sensible. You know, you gave us, in one of your books, a full year, day by day, of how to behave in an ethical way, and the satisfaction and the pleasure you'll get from it. It's an amazing, amazing thing. What motivated you to write that?
What motivated me to write it was also this. There were many Jews who were returning to an interest in Judaism. And very often when you hear somebody's becoming more interested in Judaism or more interested in becoming more religious, it tends to get associated, as I mentioned earlier, exclusively with ritual. Oh, so now you should start doing this, now you should start doing that. I'm a passionate believer in the significance of ritual. It endows personal lives with a sense of holiness. You know, it gives the continuity of the Jewish people. All of those things are true, but I also wanted to look to the Jewish tradition for what it said about ethical behavior. Because people know about tzedakah, they know about lashon hara, maybe at most they know those too, but there are hundreds of teachings in Judaism on how to be a better person.
Yeah. And your prognosis for the future in terms of Jewish life?
I'm guardedly optimistic. You know, they tell a joke about a group of elderly men who get together every day. They're all retired in Tel Aviv and talk over at a cafe, and they're always talking over the world situation, which is usually pretty somber. Then one day, one of the men in the group shocks them all by saying, "You know what? I'm an optimist." And they're all taken aback till one of them notices something fishy. Wait a second, if you're an optimist, why do you look so worried? You think it's easy to be an optimist? So I'm an optimist with a worried look on my face.
On that note, we're going to say goodbye. Thank you so much. It was a pleasure to have you here, Rabbi.
And thank
you. And thank you for being with us as well. Be with us again next week when we have another look in the Jewish world. Goodbye from Mosaic.